Gas going up and up, and this pretty much affects everything. It affects our produce prices. It affects pizza prices. Everything is affected by fuel prices. So who is to blame? That's what I want to know, because I feel much better about myself when I can blame somebody else.
And I hear a lot of people say, why don't we just use our own stuff? We have tons.
Yeah.
Why don't we drill? Why don't we
use the reserve?
Use the
right?
reserve. And so I was thrilled. I came across this article on the WashingtonPost.com, really kind of debunking and explaining really well some of these myths and some of these things you always hear people say. Robert Rapier is joining us on the air. He is the author of this article as well as an energy blog called R Squared. Robert, thanks for joining us today from sunny Hawaii.
Yeah, not quite so sunny this morning where I'm at, but generally sunny.
Generally sunny. Okay, well, you had five points here that I want to just love every one of them, and I've heard people say every one of these. And the first one is that all this fighting in Libya is making our gas prices higher. Not true. They don't really have that much anymore.
Right. Libya is not a major supplier to the world. It's the general nervousness of the whole region that bids oil prices up, because the region does supply about a quarter of the oil to the world, and we get quite a bit. The U.S. gets quite a bit of our imports from there. So, the fear is that, this spreads to Saudi Arabia, and if something happened in Saudi Arabia, regime change, you could see real shortages, and you could see, some major disruption. And that is what's affecting the price more than anything. Anytime things are going on in the Middle East, I mean, we go to war with Iraq, boom, oil prices spike up. And it's always the fear of disruption.
Right, so it's not Libya specifically. You have in this article that of the 86 million barrels consumed globally every day, less than 2% comes from Libya. So it's not Libya specifically, but those countries surrounding it.
Right. But the other thing is that the supply and demand is pretty tight. It's a lot tighter than it was 10 years ago. And so Libya can affect the world market more than it could, say, 10 years ago when there was a lot more spare capacity on. But we've drawn down reserves over the past 10 years. There's not the spare capacity there used to be. So Libya going offline will affect oil prices on the world market because there's just nobody to come on. Outside, maybe Saudi Arabia has a little bit left. But there's not a lot of people who can turn on the taps and make up for a disruption of supplies.
All right, the next one we have on the list, and I hear this all the time, anytime we get in an emergency, we need to tap into the strategic reserve of the United States. Good idea, bad idea?
That's a very bad idea. I'm going to write an article soon calling it the Speculators' Petroleum Reserve, because that's what politicians are doing whenever they want to tap into that reserve. I quoted in the article Chuck Schumer in 1999. He said oil prices have made a meteoric ascent to $25 a barrel, and we have to tap into the SPR to relieve consumers from these meteoric prices. Well, if we had done that, we would have had to put the oil back in there at a higher price because, of course, oil prices are now 4 times that. And that's the problem with using this politically. And it happens especially during election years that politicians want to go in and they want to release some of that oil. That oil is there in case of a real emergency. And gas prices going higher is not a real emergency. It's painful. We have to make sacrifices. But a real emergency is like 1973, when suddenly you don't have the oil, and you've got gas lines and you've got service stations running out of gasoline. I filled up this morning, and it $4.76 for me to fill up in Hawaii this morning. And I said, but I have the option, and that's not an emergency. An emergency is if I pull up and I'm out of gas and they don't have any gas. Now that's more of an emergency. And so the SPR is there to buy us some time in a situation like that, so that if we had to institute rationing to make sure that the police and fire departments, ambulances get their quota, that's what the SPR is there for. Well, and it shouldn't be used for political purposes. prices.
Well, and isn't it true that supply and demand does have an effect here? When those prices get up to a certain level, people start driving less, they start using public transportation more, the demand goes down, and things kind of even out again.
Yeah, and that was one of the myths that I covered, that Americans can't live without cheap gas. Cheney said a few years ago, the American way of life is non-negotiable, and it's not true, because we do respond to higher gas prices. When gas prices are low, it's like anything else. Something that's very cheap, we tend to use more of it. I wrote an article recently. I don't eat lobster every day because it's very expensive, but if it was cheap, I'd probably eat it a lot more.
Yeah, me too.
If we demanded cheap lobsters, the politicians would go out and they would subsidize the lobster industry, and they would make sure that those lobsters stayed cheap, or they'd be voted out of office. And that's what the situation is with gas prices. It's always a political issue. Politicians fear for their jobs whenever gas prices go up, so there's a lot of finger pointing, and there's a lot of talk about things like the SPR, if we only opened up everything to exploration, gas prices would come back down. But in fact, in 2008, as I pointed out in the article, as gas prices got very high, the Toyota Prius sales eclipsed the Ford Explorer, and public transit was at a 50-year high. So we do make changes in our life based on high gas prices.
Robert, the last one we have time for here is that a lot of people, I think, believe that the oil companies just don't make as much in the summer so that they can charge more. And you're saying there's kind of a chemical explanation for this.
There is. There's a difference in summer and winter gasoline. Butane is blended into gasoline in both the summer and winter, but butane boils at a low pressure. In the winter, more butane can go in. So I used to work at a refinery in Billings, Montana. In the winter, we could put 10% butane in the gasoline. In the summer, it's more like 1 or 2%. So what happens is, in the transition from winter blends to summer blends, and this is EPA regulated, you have to meet certain specifications between the winter and summer. And going to summer, they have to take the butane out of the gasoline. And so that means one of the components of the gasoline supply in the summer is limited. We can't use it. And so supplies are constrained somewhat in moving into spring, just when driving season picks up, and that's the explanation.
I love it. Robert, you just made it so easy to understand in your article. I recommend people go to the Washington Post, or actually go to our website at browser.ksl.com. Because Robert explains all these things really clearly. This is Robert Rapier. He is author of the energy blog R Squared, debunking some of those myths that we all hear all the time about gas prices.
All right, coming up on the browser.